This man literally traded human lives for power. So when you see people clowning little thirsty Marco Rubio for his gigantic ears and for having to clop clop around the White House in ginormous patent leather clown shoes that Donald Trump gifted to all his cabinet members, don't feel sorry for him because he's not a good person. We recently learned that his State Department, after the United States government dismantled the USAID, canceling out life-saving resources, support, food to millions of people across the globe that relied on it, that they have been entering into negotiations and agreements with African nations, promising to give back the aid in exchange for natural resources, data, and the ability for American labs to go into their countries. I've seen the movie The Constant Gardener, so I know how this movie ends, and you should too if you haven't seen that movie. Now, recently, Marco Rubio went before the Senate Oversight Committee to defend the unlawful, inhumane, illegal, unconstitutional human rights and civil rights violating policies of this administration. You should know that Marco Rubio folded. In fact, he sold out the entire administration. And you could thank the mainly Democratic senators and one Republican senator on the Oversight Committee for coaxing Marco Rubio to make these confessions. That's right. He confessed that Maduro really was not about drugs. It was about oil. He confessed that Donald Trump really should have gotten permission from Congress before creating the Board of Peace, that he really has no clue where the $20 billion share of the $50 billion sale of Venezuelan oil is. Donald Trump took $20 billion and put it in an offshore account in Qatar. And Marco Rubio really doesn't know. He doesn't know what the hell Donald Trump's in-laws, including his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, his former father-in-law, Masoud Boulos, and his realtor buddy, Steve Witkoff, all of them who have no foreign policy experience or background, are doing in the Ukraine and Iran, making negotiations on behalf of American people. That it was truly a pretext, that they had no legal justification for rounding up a bunch of Venezuelan young men here who are here in temporary protective status, have no criminal background history, to be sent to a foreign prison to be tortured for 100 days. And that it was unlawful. They really didn't have justifications for canceling the temporary protective status of Venezuelans here. He made all those confessions on the record in the data. And thank you to Senators Rand Paul, Van Hollen, Merkley, Rosen, Shaheen, Booker, Duckworth, for coaxing those confections. Oh, and Kane for coaxing those confections out of Marco Rubio, who just yeah. So yeah, now let's check out what they've been doing and how they were able to brilliantly bring him down to his knees. And let's discuss below.
Van Hollen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, I want to discuss corruption in the White House and its intersection with our foreign policy. The President and his family have used the office of the presidency to pocket $1.4 billion plus since he was sworn in. A New York Times analysis entitled "Trump's Plundering of America" indicates that some of that is a result of the president selling corruption here at home, but much of it relates to the president selling out U.S. interests overseas to make a killing for his family, including giving away sensitive U.S. semiconductor and AI technologies to the UAE, while the UAE pumped $2 billion into one of the Trump family ventures. And then there are all the other Trump deals that are intertwined with tariff or foreign policy matters: golf courses in Saudi Arabia and Vietnam, Trump hotels and office buildings in other countries, and of course there's the $400 million jet from Qatar. The list goes on and on. By any measure, this is the most corrupt administration in American history. We also see the president wielding U.S. power overseas in a way that advances the interests of his billionaire buddies at the expense of American interests. It was Ron Lauder, who has business ventures in Greenland, who reportedly first put the idea of grabbing Greenland into President Trump's mind. And in the case of Venezuela, President Trump has said he talked to oil executives about toppling Maduro and going into Venezuela before anyone in Congress knew. We know that in President Trump's mind, deposing Maduro was not about stopping the flow of fentanyl or drugs in the United States. He cut the budget for DEA. He pardoned the former Honduran president convicted of drug running. And the new president, Delcy Rodriguez, has herself been long suspected by DEA of being involved in drug smuggling. She's also a longtime hardened communist leader, so this operation certainly was not about bringing more freedom and democracy to Venezuela. In fact, the president told us what it was all about at his big press conference after seizing Maduro. The president said it was about oil, oil, oil. He used the word oil 19 times, never mentioned democracy or freedom or human rights. And so the pattern of corruption is clear. Now, President Trump has said publicly that he had communications with folks from the oil industry about going into Venezuela before anyone here in Congress was notified. Mr. Secretary, simple yes or no question. Were you with President Trump during any of those conversations he had with people with oil interests in Venezuela about the possibility of deposing Maduro?
That's not a simple yes or no question, but I can answer it quickly, and that is the president always elicits opinions from all sorts of people, including, for example, Chevron has an active license in Venezuela. They operate in Venezuela. They've been doing so even when the sanctions were in place. So of course you would ask Chevron, what is your opinion of Delcy Rodriguez? What are your opinion of their economy and of their prospect? But the notion that somehow the president authorized this challenge at the urging of oil executives is absurd. That never happened.
Mr. Secretary, I'm asking whether you were with the president.
That never happened. I couldn't be with him because it never happened. The oil executives were not involved whatsoever in any of the planning on this matter. None.
Did the president, as he said publicly, inform them about the U.S. operations?
I think all of those executives learned about this operation the same time everybody else did.
Well, President Trump has said the opposite in public.
No.
Yes, he has. I mean, he said it. I think it was aboard Air Force One on an airplane. It's on public record. You can take a look. Look, Paul Singer, who you know, gave $8 million toward Trump's 2024 campaign. Conveniently, through his hedge fund, he's acquired Citgo out of bankruptcy, which is suddenly very, very valuable. Did you or President Trump have any communications with Paul Singer about Venezuelan oil in the months leading up to the military action in Venezuela?
I can tell you I did not, and I would be very surprised what the president did in that regard. And in fact, that Singer position that you've outlined, which is not just him but other creditors, was actually was blocked. We don't want to see. It's one of the reasons why we had to do this account in a third country in the interim, is because we don't want it to be something that's picked apart by creditors.
I appreciate that, and we'll monitor it carefully. There's also Vitol. They've been given a license for Venezuelan oil worth about $250 million. Vitol's senior partner, John Addison, gave $6 million to the Trump-aligned PACs in the last cycle. And the list goes on, Mr. Secretary. And I have to say that when you have the President of the United States himself, after taking Maduro, get up and say this was about oil, 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 it does make all of us ask the question whether he put men and women in the U.S. military at risk simply so he could grab that oil.
Well, that oil, yeah, and I don't know if you were here. I think you were here the whole hearing. I don't think you had left. Number one, the only reason why we use Trafi and Vitol is simply because in the short term, we had to move 50 million barrels of oil that were stuck. And Venezuela needed to turn that into cash so that they wouldn't have systemic collapse. And the fastest way to do it in the short term is for the traders to do it, because that's in the business that they're in. That is not the permanent structure. The permanent structure we want to see is a normal oil industry where it's sold directly. You know, companies have licenses down there, they have an arrangement to pay royalties, and they move the oil directly to their refineries or sell it in the global market, not through middlemen. Yeah. The only reason why they were used in this instance is because we had an acute short-term problem, which is how do we provide funding from their own revenue, not ours, to keep their government afloat. So in essence, we allowed Venezuela to use their own oil to generate revenue to pay teachers and firefighters and police officers and keep the function of government operating so we didn't have systemic collapse. But that system with those traders, that is not the long-term plan here at all.
My only point, Mr. Secretary, is those folks who gave a lot of money to the Trump campaign have done very well as a result of what's happened. Thank you.
Over which branch of government should have the power to declare or initiate war. Virtually unanimously, they decided, and what was entered into the Constitution was that the declaration or initiation of war would be the power of Congress. Now, we have many advocates, many of whom are here today, who have been advocates for an expansive notion of presidential power. They often argue that wars are not really wars, that they're kinetic actions or drug busts. I think, though, if you reverse the circumstances, it becomes very difficult for these arguments to hold up. So I would ask you, if a foreign country bombed our air defense missiles, captured and removed our president, and blockaded our country, would that be considered an act of war?
Well, I think your question is about and I will acknowledge you've been very consistent on all these points the entire career. So let me, no matter who's in charge. So I will point to two things. The first is it's hard for us to conceive that an operation that lasted about 4.5 hours and was a law enforcement operation to capture someone we don't recognize as a head of state, indicted in the United States, wanted with a $50 million bounty.
My question would be, if it only took 4 hours to take our president, it's very short, nobody dies on the other side, nobody dies on our side, it's perfect. Would it be an act of war?
We just don't believe that this operation comes anywhere close to the constitutional definition of war.
But would it be an act of war if someone did it to us? Nobody dies, few casualties, they're in and out. Boom, it's a perfect military operation. Would that be an act of war? Of course it would be an act of war. I'm probably the most anti-war person in the Senate, and I would vote to declare war if someone invaded our country and took our president. So I think we need to at least acknowledge this is a one-way argument. One-way arguments that don't rebound, that you can't apply to yourselves, that cannot be universally applicable are bad arguments. So my next question would be, let's say it's not a war. And we're just going to define it away and say it's not a war. That's one of the arguments. So it's a drug bust. What if a foreign country indicts our president for violating a foreign law? Should we extradite our president, or should we be okay if they come in and get him by force?
Look, I think ultimately we're always going to act in our national interest. And so if somebody comes after our national interest, like the case you've described, which obviously does not exist at this time, but the case you've described, the U.S. always has the right to act in its national interest and to protect itself. So really I don't know about this equivalency. Well, does this justify them doing it? We're always going to do what's best for the United States and America. We're always going to protect our system.
But the point isn't, and you're exactly right, we will act in our national interest and we should. So I'm not disagreeing with you at all. What I'm saying is, though, that our arguments are empty then. The drug bust isn't really an argument. It's a ruse. The war argument, not a war, is a ruse. It's not a real argument. And we do what we do because we have the force, we have the might, we do it because it's in our interest. So we wouldn't let anybody come in, bomb us, blockade us, and take our president. We've had arguments about legitimate, illegitimate presidents, bad elections, rigged elections. So there's all kinds of same arguments that we've had in our country that they've had in Venezuela. But we wouldn't argue for an indictment. And these things aren't idle speculation. I mean, Netanyahu's been indicted by the ICC. And one of the reasons I object to being part of the ICC, and I would say you and the administration probably agree, is we're not going to let any international council indict our president and arrest him somewhere on foreign soil. We're not going to do that. We actually, most of us probably object to indicting Netanyahu in that way as well. So I think the arguments are invalid. So we did get the legal opinion that Senator Kaine referred to, the OLC opinion, Office of Legal Counsel. And I think a lot of it's been released. Plus, they came to our caucus and talked most of the open about everything they had classified. So I will talk about at least one of the arguments. They say this war wasn't a constitutional war. Therefore, it doesn't rise to the constitutional notion of us declaring or having to initiate the war. It just doesn't rise. And one of their main arguments was not enough people died. And so there is some number that they aren't specific, but there is some number. I would assume, although I'm not positive, but the 50, 60,000 soldiers who died in Vietnam might be enough for them to call that a war. But here's the problem. It isn't the number, it's that it happens in retrospect. See, our founders gave us the power to initiate or declare war. They didn't give us other powers to execute the war. Those are left to the president. But if we have to wait to see how many people are killed, we have to wait, as they describe it, as the scope, nature, and extent. If we have to wait to see the scope, nature, and extent, the war has been going on for some time. It's hard to vote to initiate a war that's been going on. And we can say this war is over, but we're still blockading it, and we may go back in. But there are no clear answers. You know, we put 2,000, we leave 2,000 troops in. Are we going to call that war and initiate it? So the definition of war is very important. And I think we have to acknowledge the problems with our argument. Calling things kinetic action is a disservice to our soldiers. Oh, you weren't really wounded in war. You don't have a Medal of Honor for war. You have a Medal of Honor for a kinetic action. So I think let's call it what it is, and let's vote on these things. But I think we're in violation of both the spirit and the law of the Constitution by bombing a capital, blockading a country, and removing elected officials. And we certainly wouldn't tolerate it, nor would I if someone did it to us.
But we didn't remove an elected official. We removed someone who was not elected, and it was actually an indicted drug trafficker in the United States. And their system—
Our laws, indicted under our laws. Look, Bolsonaro says that Da Silva is not really the president of Brazil. Our president said Biden wasn't really the president. Hillary Clinton said in 2016 Trump wasn't the president. So you have these arguments, and I agree with you. It probably was, and most likely was, most assuredly was a bad election. He wasn't really elected. But at the same time, if that's our predicate, and you don't have to come to us because it's a drug bust, we're just removing somebody, you can see where it leads to, and it leads to chaos. And that's why we have rules like the Constitution, so we don't get so far out there that presidents can do whatever they want. It is this check and balance. And I would argue for 70 years we've been going the wrong way. It isn't just this president, but it's a debate that I think is worth having.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to associate myself with the comments of Tim Kaine. The fact that we're
I'm going to get right into it because I want to build on Senator Van Hollen's line of questioning. President Trump pardoned the former Honduran president after he was convicted of trafficking roughly 400 tons of cocaine into the United States, cocaine that contributed to the deaths of tens of thousands of Americans year after year. Yet the president and his cabinet authorized a military operation to capture Nicolas Maduro in order to arrest him for virtually the same crime. So yes or no, because I have a bunch of questions here. To the best of your knowledge, was Hernandez convicted of trafficking approximately 400 tons of cocaine into the United States?
I'm not involved in the pardon process. I can tell you.
No, I'm just asking if he—
yeah, but I don't do yes or no. I don't play games. This is not a game show.
Do you know he was— okay, so I'm just going to tell you he was—
So I can answer your question because I know what you're getting at, but go ahead.
He was convicted. I know.
The president felt that he was unfairly treated. I can't give you much insight because I'm not involved in the pardon process.
Would you not concede? Can you not understand how the American people and how the world are clearly going to be frustrated by the hypocrisy of this when one man is convicted and pardoned and another man captured, and how it undermines the United States' credibility on the world stage?
No, but the difference is that, again, I can't opine on the specifics of his case because I wasn't involved in the pardon, but he was not a sitting office holder. He was not even the president of Honduras when that decision was made, either to convict him. The difference between him and Nicolas Maduro is he was actively engaged in narco trafficking. It was an ongoing endeavor.
I think it does undermine our credibility, but I'm going to move on to some foreign policy decision-making here, because despite the fact that you famously or infamously have numerous jobs in the administration, your Secretary of State, your National Security Advisor, it is increasingly unclear who's actually directing U.S. foreign policy under President Trump. We have a special envoy Witkoff. He's reportedly conducted Russian-Ukraine talks in Switzerland beyond your awareness. He and Jared Kushner have been described as managing the president's Gaza plan. Meanwhile, Ambassador Barrack is leading on Syria policy, while Special Envoy Boulos is appearing to lead on our Africa policy. So I have to ask you, I know the answer to this, but I'm going to ask you, are you the lead for U.S. government on foreign policy?
No. The lead on U.S. foreign policy is named Donald J. Trump, the President of the United States. On the individuals you've described, these are very valuable teams. We have if I can answer, because I think it's important. It's a legitimate question. I have the distinction, but I think both the benefit of being the National Security Advisor and the Secretary of State. As National Security Advisor, my job is to coordinate the interagency function of national security, and that involves foreign policy. So I speak to Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner in the case of Gaza and now Russia, probably 10 times a day. We have multiple meetings and coordination. All of it is we build a team, we gather facts, we present options, and then we take them to the president. It is the president who directs the the foreign policy of the United States. That's always been the case, by the way.
You can't overrule their decisions. Do you outrank the special envoys and ambassadors? Do they get your input as
an example,
do they care about your input, or do they go straight to the president?
There's no time in which the president is presented an option by one of us at the exemption of everybody else. It depends on the portfolio. But in every one of these portfolios, we have a team approach to this, which is the way the system is supposed to work. It's not the way it's always worked. You have had in the past tensions between the National Security Council that became operational in the Department of State. In this particular case, there's not much conflict between the two because it's the same person. And we basically, what we basically try to do in every one of these unique missions is we create a consensus team around it, and then we present the president options together. It's the president's decision, nobody else's. There's no overruling here. The president makes the decision. Our job is to present him options.
Shouldn't they report to you? Shouldn't there be a line of command and a line of transparency?
They report to me every day.
Where does the buck stop?
But they report to me every day in terms of keeping me apprised of what's happening. I give advice. I give, in some cases, direction. They involved heavily. For example, the special envoys rely almost exclusively on State Department personnel to assist them in all of their efforts. For example, on the Board of Peace, we helped them position the entire gathering last week and all of the work that's going to happen now. On every one of these issues, it's not linear. No single individual other than the president has the ability to dictate our foreign policy. Our job is to come to a consensus view on the best way forward. Where there are disputes, those are presented to the president, and he makes the decision.
Let's talk about the Board of Peace then, because all treaties and statutes have to be approved by Congress, and the president is starting a new Board of Peace, and we would need that authority. The authority for the filing stems from the International Organizations Immunities Act, but it's my understanding it only provides the president with such authority when participation by the in an organization has been approved by treaty or statute. Treaties and statutes must be approved by Congress, so when will the administration be requesting Congress pass legislation to authorize the president to extend this benefits to the Board of Peace, creating the Board of Peace, and when will it be sent?
Well, actually, the Board of Peace was chartered and set up by the UN Security Council through a vote of the UN Security Council as the deliberation. So it's an international organism recognized by the Security Council of the United Nations, which is something I think many of you should be supportive of, the fact that we're doing it.
The president is claiming his authority is from the International Organizations Immunities Act, and this law only provides the president authority when U.S. participation has been approved by treaty or statute. I know my time is up. Please consider working with us to do these things. You know what it is to be a senator. You know what that collaboration and cooperation mean. And I think that all of us expect that respect from you and would really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Right, so it's government. What happened to the other $200 million?
It's still sitting in the account, is my understanding at this time.
The account in Qatar?
Well, the account, yes, but that will ultimately be that's a short-term account. Ultimately, it will be a U.S. Treasury blocked account in the United States.
And will it also be audited?
Correct. Well, the audit will be on the expenditures. At the front end, we'll tell them this is what the money can be spent on. Again, I'm not talking about all the other revenues the Venezuelan government may have. We're talking about the revenues from the sanctioned oil. At the front end, we will say this is what the allowable expenses are. And then they will agree to fund, as part of the overall cost, they will pay for and fund an audit system acceptable to us to ensure that that's how the money was spent.
And can you report to this committee once that audit system is set up?
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
I'd like to change the topic in my short time that I have left, because when you were a member of this committee, you authored legislation to prevent President Trump from unilaterally leaving NATO, you and Senator Kaine. Do you still believe that the U.S. benefits from NATO?
We do. I mean, the problem, but NATO needs to be reimagined as well in terms of the obligations. And this is not new to this president. Multiple presidents have complained about it.
I agree.
think this president just complains about it louder than other presidents.
Well, I'm just trying to be clear, get a clear answer on where this administration stands relative to NATO, because it's been a very fuzzy message over the last year. And do you agree that we're stronger in confronting China when we do so with like-minded partners, and that China is still the #1 threat that we face in the United States?
Yeah, but our like-minded partners have to have capability, and that's been part of the problem, is the erosion in European defense capabilities, because they've taken vast amount of the monies that these are rich countries, and because of the NATO umbrella, it gave them the flexibility to spend a tremendous amount of their revenues on social programs and not on defense. Now, maybe that trend line will begin to change.
Well, it's already begun to change, frankly, and thanks. And I think the president deserves credit for that, for the fact that there is now a commitment for 5% of GDP to be spent on defense. But part of that strength also comes not just from having the the mechanism, the military might, but it also comes from the unity with our allies. And to the extent to which that unity is undermined, like the talk about Greenland and antagonizing Denmark, then it undermines NATO's ability. And the only people who are excited about that are Vladimir Putin and President Xi.
Yeah, well, I would say that I think our alliances in NATO ultimately are something that's going to work out. Our partners understand the importance of the U.S. presence in NATO. Without the U.S., there is no NATO. And we understand that in order for NATO to be stronger, our partners need to be stronger. And one of the things we've explained to our allies in NATO is the United States is not simply focused on Europe. We also have defense needs in the Western Hemisphere. We have defense needs in the Indo-Pacific. And it will require us. We may be the richest country in the world, but we don't have unlimited resources. And as we reassign
exactly why we want to have allies and partners to help us as we're looking at conflicts around the world. And when we antagonize our allies and partners, and when we send Canada to do a trade deal with China instead of coming to New Hampshire or the United States, it weakens our ability to confront our adversaries.
Yeah, but our allies have to be two things. They have to be willing to step up, but they also have to be capable of stepping up. And frankly, many of them have not. I mean, Spain is still not doing the 5%. I mean, there are countries that are still not doing. And in fact, Mark Rutte yesterday pointed out that if without the United States, the countries of Europe would have to spend 10% of their GDP for the next 20 years to be able to make up the whole. So I do think there needs to be a rebalancing, and hopefully we'll have cooperation. I think we will. Rutte has done a great job of managing all.
And I'm not arguing that point with you. As I said, I agree with what the president has asked of our European allies. What I'm arguing his rhetoric with you about is his rhetoric is undermining our NATO with our allies, and that's a problem. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. This is the first oversight hearing, is really a complete failure of the responsibility of Congress, failure of this committee to demand oversight, but also a reflection of the reluctance of the administration to engage in the proper consultation with Congress. So I hope we can do a lot better going forward, and that we'll see you at least every 6 weeks or so, not every five months. I also feel like the strategy of keeping basically these very weak arguments secret so that they can't be discussed openly for the legal justifications. I've gone down and read them, and there's a reason obviously you'd be incredibly embarrassed if those were public. So make them public. Let's have an actual transparency here in the United States of America. And let's be clear about what has gone on. We had a dictator we didn't like. We've replaced it with a dictator we think we can manipulate. And if that doesn't work, we'll do something else in order to pry open that economy for oil. And I must say that you did say something I liked. So let me emphasize that.
I'm making progress.
Yeah. You said no U.S. taxpayer dollars will be used, no spending on our part, to kind of prop up Venezuela. Can you restate your commitment to that?
Yeah, they're not going to need it. For example, we're not spending money in Venezuela right now. I mean, obviously, look, I think you're putting aside embassy operations and all of that. And by the way, there may be some program through foreign aid that some of you might be interested in the future. We don't think that Venezuela is the kind of country that needs that. This is a very wealthy country.
Thank you. I'm glad you restated that, because I think that we will see some moment when the administration says, let's subsidize our American oil companies to rebuild the infrastructure in Venezuela. And I must say that's a very unpopular idea among my constituents. I think America needs a lot of investments in infrastructure here. And I think you have a way too rosy sense of the oil economy there. Many experts have said, look, without 10-year prospect horizon of stability, without Canada deciding to ship a lot more of its heavy oil instead of to the Gulf, doing it to Asia so that we prop up the kind of demand in the Gulf, without keeping Iran off the international stage so that the cost of oil, the value is higher. All of those factors would have to be there for our oil companies to want to invest their own money. So I think they'll be coming to the administration. I think you'll all be trying to find some way to subsidize them. But I'm glad what you said today, that you're not going to do it, and I want to hold the administration accountable to that. Second, on terms of the $500 million fund, $300 million, my understanding, has gone back to the Central Bank of Venezuela, and they have essentially exchanged it for bolivars to key industry players. I don't think we have any transparency on what corporations or entities got that hard currency. And yet you did say there's going to be a lot of transparency. You also said, if I understood right, that those funds are eventually going to be brought back into the structure of U.S. control as part of our, formal structure of funds. And in that sense, the Constitution says no money shall be drawn from the Treasury but in consequence of appropriations made in law. So are you going to make sure that if that money comes back into kind of full U.S. control, not an offshore account the way it is now, that we're going to abide by the Constitution? Third point here is that one of the things that transpired is cutting off the oil to Cuba. And I know you have a strong interest in making life difficult for the leadership in Cuba. Can you lay out for us what other things you might be planning in that regard and how those fit into an overall plan?
Yeah, well, I'll try to do that in a minute. Let me just say on the rosy projections of oil, it's not rosy projection. I mean, it's either going to happen or it's not. In essence, oil, there's no world in which the United States is subsidizing investment in Venezuelan oil. It's very simple. Oil company will go in and say, okay, this is the oil you have. This is how much it's going to cost us investing on the front end to one end make money, pay back our investment plus a profit at the back end, and then depending on the terms of that investment, they'll make a decision about whether it makes sense for that or not. Right now, what you have in Venezuela is a corrupt and broken oil company run by the government that basically takes this money, doesn't reinvest in it at all, and basically sprinkles it to its people to keep the glue that keeps the regime together. We want it to become a normal oil economy. That's what the ultimate goal is here. And in a normal oil economy, companies are going to go in, they're going to look at Venezuelan law, they're going to look at Venezuelan authorities, and they're going to make a determination about whether or not it's worth their investment. And that's the normalization process that we're talking about. That's going to be up to them if they want to have a normal oil economy as opposed to one that is basically used as a way to feed graft in a very inefficient way, but they didn't care about that. If they do it the right way, we think it has great promise and potential over the long term, especially because these investments take a long time. But the U.S. doesn't have to put any money to encourage companies to go in and invest, nor is there any interest in doing so. But a lot of it.
That's a point I really do appreciate.
Yeah, no,
I don't want to see.
Well, I don't even think
American
that's even
taxpayer
been.
dollars going in.
I don't think that's even been discussed or considered by anybody. Your second point was, I wrote it here, but now.
It's the $300 million
here,
being
I've had to start
redistributed
using
to
these. I
corporations in Venezuela. And
The second one was what, I'm sorry?
lack of accountability over that. The $300
Oh,
million
yeah.
has already been distributed.
On the account. So that's not the permanent structure we want to see. In the long term, we just want them to have a normal industry where the companies are involved in there, they're selling it directly to the market, and we're out of that game. What we're talking about now is the sanctioned oil, the oil that's under our sanction. So we have to monitor how that money moves. So yes, the first $300 million moved for the following reason. We would all agree we didn't want to see systemic collapse. Like one of the things a lot of you told me you were worried about on the short term is this is going to trigger internal chaos in Venezuela. 1 million people are going to storm the border with Colombia. Colombia even stood up troops to their border to prevent it. Brazil was worried about it as well. It's going to lead to fighting in the streets between rival factions and shooting. None of that has happened. And key to that stabilization is ensuring that the government had enough money to meet payroll and meet their basic needs as part of the stabilization. We should not confuse stabilization with transition. This is not what the permanent structure is going to look like. The Treasury's handling the structuring of that account, so I would refer you to them, and I can get you an answer for them as to what the legal framework of that Treasury blocked account is going to look like.
That would be very helpful, because what you just mentioned, money to meet payroll, is very different than what we've heard about the money being used to give hard currency to key corporations inside of Venezuela, which would not be meeting payroll.
Well, which
This is where complete oversight is required. We'd like to have transparency over how that's made.
Yeah, remember, the first $300 million we're going to have to, on that one, because of the urgency in moving funds to keep the place stable, is going to require us to undertake a retroactive audit of how that money was spent, the first $300 million. But there's probably another $2.5 to $3 billion down the pike at some point, which will have front end through this process I described. I'm not sure if you were here where I described it, and we're still finalizing it. But basically, the way it would look is we would send them a letter saying, on the sanctioned oil proceeds, this is what it could be spent on, and you have to agree to contribute, you have to agree to pay for an auditing system to make sure that that's how it's being spent. That's the process we're trying to create. Again, on Friday, we'll mark the 4-week mark of this all began. I understand, we live in a world where the items move very quickly. This was front page news of 3 weeks ago when we scheduled this hearing, and today other items have captured the attention, but we remain focused on it. So it's only been 3 or 4 weeks, but that's the process we're setting up with Treasury, and obviously as we finalize it, we'll provide that to you. But this is not permanent. This is not the system we want to see in place in the long term. We want to see a normal country. What was your third question?
Cuba.
Oh, Cuba.
Cuba.
Oh, okay. I'll tell you about Cuba.
Wow, how novel. Finally, a public hearing in the Senate or House. This is the first public hearing we've had. 200 folks who are on secret designated combatant lists have been killed. U.S. troops have been injured. Hundreds of millions of dollars have been spent. An armada amassed. The announcement of a new Monroe Doctrine, which does not land well in the Americas. Democrats have been asking over and over again, can we have a public hearing? Can we share what we know with the American public? Finally, a public hearing. But even that hearing is constrained. I'd like to talk about the complete weakness of the legal rationale about the strikes on boats in international waters, but I can't because the administration has only shared it with members in a classified setting. I can't tell you why the domestic rationale is hollow and the international rationale is hollow. I can't tell you why the rationale for attacking Venezuela is hollow because, again, the rationale has been shared with us in a closed setting. I can't share with you the grim details of the murder of shipwrecked survivors in open waters that we all know because we've seen the videos and we've questioned the U.S. military officials involved about legality because the administration will not release that publicly. They released the boat strike videos publicly, but they hid the second strike that killed struggling shipwrecked survivors, even from Congress, for nearly 3 months, but I can't really talk to you about it. I can't talk to you about the weakness of the targeting criteria being used to attack boats in the Caribbean and Pacific. I would encourage any colleague, if you have not, go to the classified setting and ask for a briefing on each strike and ask this question: what was the evidence that there were narcotics on that craft? You will be very surprised if you ask that question about every strike. And so even in this first public hearing, 5 months in, there's a lot we can't talk about. If it was such a righteous operation, why is the administration and the majority in this Senate so jealously protecting the details about it from being revealed to the American public? I have Virginians deployed in this operation. I can't answer their families' questions. Thank God we're having a public hearing 5 months in. This is supposed to be the greatest deliberative body in the world. Mr. Secretary, who won the July 2024 Venezuelan presidential election?
Oh, I think the whole world would acknowledge it was Edmundo Gonzalez.
Who lost that election?
Maduro.
And his vice president, Delcy Rodriguez. Now, you have made the decision, the administration has made the decision in the aftermath of the attack that Delcy Rodriguez should be leading the country. Let me read something that President Trump said about her on January 14 about Delcy Rodriguez, who lost the election with Maduro. We just had a great conversation today, and she's a terrific person. I mean, she's somebody that we have worked with very well. Let me tell you what Delcy Rodriguez said the day after Venezuela was attacked. Governments around the world are simply shocked that the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela is the victim and target of an attack of this nature, which undoubtedly has Zionist undertones. What the hell did Delcy Rodriguez mean when she said this attack had Zionist undertones? I'm assuming you have no idea.
Oh, I have an idea what she meant. I mean, what's the question?
What does she mean when she says this attack has Zionist undertones?
Look, I'd have to answer, but let me understand in a broader context. No one here is telling you that this is what we want to see in the long term.
Okay.
This is not a campaign to leave in place the system that's currently in place.
Let me switch.
But we either have, but I mean, the criticism of us is, all right, go ahead. No, go ahead.
I'm ready to switch now to talk about somebody that you know well.
You raised an important point. If I can get back to it, I will.
You know well and you respect well Maria Corina Machado. Here's what President Trump said about her. Won the Nobel Prize in the aftermath of the attack on Venezuela. I think it would be very tough for her to be the leader. She doesn't have the support within or the respect within the country. She's a very nice woman, but she doesn't have the respect. What did President Trump mean by that?
Yeah. First of all, I've known Maria Corina for probably 12 years, 13 years. Have dealt with her probably more than anybody, as much as anybody on this committee has for certain. And I'll be meeting with her today, in fact. And we met with her a couple weeks ago. So here's the reality, though, and I think what the president was pointing to. And I think Maria Corina would acknowledge this.
The only way I talked to her last week.
Well,
she's very disappointed in those comments, and so are Venezuelans in my state.
Okay, well, she didn't share that with me or with us, but I would sell this to you. For the president is acknowledging is that today, as it stands, whether we like it or not, the elements of control in that country, the people with the guns, the people that control the guns and the institutions of government there, are in the hands of this regime. So we either, on the one hand, we're getting criticized. Some people are saying we don't want regime change. On the other hand, we're being criticized for not undertaking regime change.
Mr. Secretary,
what we're trying to trigger here is a process of stabilization, recovery, and transition to something where Maria Corina and others can be a part of. And that's what we're working
You have
for.
respect for her, don't you?
Sure.
Okay, great. My last question is this.
And so does the president, by the way. He met with her. They had a great meeting. And he actually he spoke to her last week in my presence.
Here's what he said after that meeting. We're talking to her, and maybe we can get her involved in some way. I'd love to be able to do that. Maybe we can do that. We'll set the terms for this Nobel Prize winner having a leadership role. Last question is this. You talked about the speech in Davos. Here's something the president said in Davos. I'm helping NATO until the last few days. When I told them about Iceland, they loved me. They're not here for us on Iceland, that I can tell you. Our stock market took the first dip yesterday because of Iceland, so Iceland has already cost us a lot of money. The president repeatedly mistook Iceland for Greenland, right? We're not mad at Iceland. They haven't cost us any money. The president just mistook the two countries for each other, correct?
Yeah, he meant to say Greenland, but I think we're all familiar with presidents that have verbal stumbles. We've had presidents like that before. Some made a lot more than this one.
Nice try. Thanks.
All right. Thank you. I thought he did well.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Murphy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Listen, I think the scope of the project that you are undertaking in Venezuela is without precedent. You are taking their oil at gunpoint. You are holding and selling that oil, putting for now the receipts in an offshore Middle Eastern account. You're deciding how and for what purposes that money is going to be used in a country of 30 million people. I think a lot of us believe that that is destined for failure. And I know that you're telling us today just to be patient, but a month later, we have no information on a timetable for a democratic transition. Maduro's people are still in charge. Most of the political prisoners are in jail. And by the way, those that have been let out have a gag order on them from the government. The opposition leader is still in exile. This looks already like it is a failure. You say you're in serious talks, but as you note, the Venezuelans are great at being in serious talks. They almost never deliver. So I'm just going to give you my three questions and hope that you'll answer them, because I do think we want to try to understand how to judge the efficacy of this as time goes on, because I worry you won't be back before this committee anytime soon, and to understand whether this is just facilitating corruption, both in Venezuela and here at home. So here are my three questions. First, reports are that you've given no-bid licenses to two companies to sell Venezuela's oil. One of them is a massive donor to the president. To many Americans, that reeks. And so my question is, can you commit that partners for future sales are going to be chosen through a fair, open selection process? Second, if Delcy Rodriguez, who is an unelected leader, the head of Maduro's torture operation, is still in power 6 months from now, does that mean that your policy is a success or failure? How do we judge when we've had enough of Rodriguez? And third, in your testimony, you reserved the right to use force again in the future if the Venezuelan government isn't complying with your requests. So if, for instance, they refused to give you access to the oil in the future, if they said, we're just going to keep it for ourselves, would this cause you to consider military action? And do you concede that if you're using military action simply to try to compel cooperation from the government, you absolutely need congressional authorization for that? So if you can answer those three questions.
So the first question was about the trading companies. The second is about Delcy still in power 6 months from now.
6 months from now.
And the third is on the use of force.
Yes.
Okay. On the first one, the two traders. So here's the problem we faced. The problem we face in the short term is they had no place to put oil. They were running out of storage capacity for their oil. We had to move that oil to market very quickly. The only way to move it to market very quickly is to plug into these two primary trade companies that could sell it in the open market. That is not the permanent outcome here. That is a short-term fix to a short-term problem, which is they were literally storing oil. They brought in tankers and had tankers sitting offshore just to hold their oil. At some point, their capacity to produce was going to be shut down and their ability to generate revenue. So we had to move that oil very quickly. The long-term plan is not those two trading companies. The long-term plan is for them to have a normal energy program that sells directly into the market, directly. To refineries and to companies that are exploiting and exploring it. For example, Chevron has operations there that never stopped. They seek to expand those operations. They don't need those trading companies. So those trading companies were a short-term fix for a very acute problem because we wanted to prevent societal collapse because they had no money for revenue. On the second point about her being still in power, look, let me say this, a couple things. This is not unprecedented. I can point to a number of places, Spain, Paraguay, 2 examples of places in which there was a transition, you know, from an autocratic regime to a democratic regime, and it took time. I can't give you a timeline of how long it takes. It can't take forever. It's not even been 4 weeks since Maduro was reduced.
A year, two
Well, I think
years?
we need to be, let me put it to you this way, we need to be much further along 6 months from now, even 3 months from now. That may not be satisfactory to you, but I'm saying we have to be much further along 3, 4, 5 months. 3 or 4, 5 months from now cannot look like what today looks like. And I think there's acknowledgement on both sides of that. I can probably give you a better answer, and this is not deflecting, when we finally have people on the ground like the ambassador and the team around her on a daily basis that are interacting. Because one thing is for me to pick up the phone and talk to Delcy Rodriguez 3 times a week. Another thing is to have someone on the ground on a daily basis that's following these events, is talking to civil society, but also engaging with interim authorities. But the fact of the matter is that, yes, we want to see quick progress. As you said, it's unprecedented, okay? All I'm saying to you is, before this was stagnant. Before this, we had spent 14 years, you were involved in some of those efforts, 14 years trying to change the dynamic in Venezuela. 13, 12, 11, 10, it was a big part of my career in the Senate was spent on this. This is the first time in over a decade that we see even the glimmer of an opportunity to change conditions. A lot of that will depend on us, but a lot of that will depend on them. And it also will depend on the rest of Venezuelan society. How quickly can we get all these Venezuelans that want to go back to Venezuela and participate in civic and economic life back to Venezuela? That's going to be critical here. We recognize that. So yes, we have to be much further along in 6 months. We expect to be further along. And if we're not, I'll tell you, we'll tell you. On the third point of use of force, look, the president never rules out his options as commander-in-chief to protect the national interest of the United States. I can tell you right now with full certainty, we are not postured to, nor do we intend or expect to have to take any military action in Venezuela at any time. The only military presence you will see in Venezuela is our Marine Guards at an embassy. Okay, that is our goal, that is our expectation, and that is what everything that outlines towards. But that said, if an Iranian drone factory pops up and threatens our forces in the region, the president retains the option to eliminate that threat.
I'm asking a more specific question because in your testimony, you suggest that you would use force to compel cooperation, for instance, with oil sales. Do you agree that you have to come to Congress to get authorization if you were simply using force to try to compel cooperation?
Well, there's 2 things. There's the
it seems like
under the War Powers Act. No, under the War Powers Act, if we're going to be involved in something that's going to put us involved in a sustained way, we have to notify you within 48 hours after the fact, and then if it's going to last longer than 60 days, we have to come to Congress with it. We don't anticipate either of these things having to happen. Everything is moving in a very different trajectory right now. On the other hand, if we tell them we don't want to see drones from Iran, as an example, pointed at the United States or threatening our forces or our presence in the region or our allies' presence in the region, and they refuse to comply with that, the president does reserve the option in self-defense to eliminate that threat. We don't see that, we don't anticipate it, but it could happen. But we hope not. We don't want it to happen. On the contrary, if we had to take military action, it would set us back on all these other things that we're talking about. I can tell you military action is not good for, recovery and transition. That's not what we hope to see. It's certainly not our goal here. But a lot of that will depend on them. But I think it would require the emergence of an imminent threat of the kind that we do not anticipate at this time. But that's not, they get a vote on that too.
Very kind, so I can get her to that. Thank you. Mr. Secretary, last March, the president invoked the Alien Enemies Act, a notorious wartime law last used for Japanese internment. He said that he was responding to the Maduro regime's supposed invasion or other acts of war against the United States. But in recent weeks, you, the Department of Justice, and our friends across the aisle have repeatedly said that we are not at war with Venezuela. Secretary Rubio, if that is true and we are not at war with Venezuela, will you advise the president to rescind his invocation of the Wartime Alien Enemies Act?
Well, that was a mechanism to remove people from our country that prevent grave danger. So, for example, we know for a fact that Tren de Aragua is a very dangerous gang. In fact, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, I may have been the first member of Congress.
This is a wartime act, Mr. Secretary.
Well,
are we currently at war with Venezuela?
No, we're not in a state of war in Venezuela.
Okay, the Supreme Court has described the Alien Enemies Act as a wartime power, our Supreme Court. And before now, the Alien Enemies Act was only invoked during the War of 1812, World War I, World War II, when it was used to intern thousands of innocent civilians. Are you really arguing that the president should be able to wield an internment law?
No, but we're talking about two separate things here. So you're talking about the state of Venezuela or are describing the regime. And we're talking about, but what the president designated.
Invoked the Alien Enemies Act.
I know, Senator, but let me be clear with you. No, but what the president was talking about are these gangs that have, and these narco-trafficking groups that are waging war on the United States. There's no doubt. These groups have waged war on the United States. They have waged, for example, Tren de Aragua is not just a criminal gang presence in our street. It is a criminal gang directly responsible for narco-trafficking.
The Trump administration has acknowledged that the vast majority of the men it rounded up and deported to torture under this law had no criminal records whatsoever.
We didn't torture anybody.
Over 75%.
Who did we torture? We haven't tortured anybody. We've arrested people that are members of gangs and we've deported them. We don't want gang members in our country.
Independent investigations have found that many of the men were here legally. If the administration is willing to lie about who it's targeting under this law, what protections do totally innocent people have against abuse? Again, I want to ask you, will you advise the president to rescind his invocation of the Wartime Alien Enemies Act?
No, of course not. I mean, these are people that are threats to the national security of the United States. But I've described this in hearings in the past, including
so you're saying that we're at war?
We are absolutely. When it comes to narco-trafficking groups and criminal gangs that are targeting the United States for criminal activity,
we're in a state of war.
There's no doubt about the fact that we're confronting them in a warlike setting because they're waging war on us.
And do the Geneva Convention
They're waging war against us and they're enemy combatants as a result of it. And the fact of the matter is that we are confronting these irregular groups, and that's one of the great challenges of the new century in this hemisphere in particular, is that these non-state actors who possess state-like capabilities in terms of their weaponry pose a grave danger to the United States. I don't think any American would dispute that we have cartels that pose a threat to the national security of the United States.
With all of the other laws of when it comes to warfare. I mean, you're saying that he can invoke this wartime power.
No, I'm saying, you're asking me, I'm here to discuss foreign policy and what's in the realm of the Department of State.
Well,
I think your questions are better directed at the Department of Justice.
Enemies Act,
but I would tell you that,
which is a wartime, which is something that
but you're asking me a question that's,
can be invoked during wartime.
But you're asking me a question
it's only been invoked during the War of 1812, World War I, and World War II. It's only been invoked 3 times, and this president is invoking it.
Okay, you're asking me a question about the domestic application of a law that's best directed to the Department of Justice.
It's not a complication.
Because you're asking me something to opine on something that's in the realm of the Department of Justice in terms of its domestic application. I can tell you that the United States is most certainly confronting terrorist and criminal organizations operating in our hemisphere that pose a grave danger to the United States. Anyone who believes that gangs that flood our country with fentanyl or cocaine are not threats to the United States is not living in reality and certainly does not reflect the opinion of most Americans.
The president already said that he was ready to put American troops in Venezuela again. So we're at war right now. So if things don't go well with the Chavistas you've empowered,
when did the president say he was going to put troops in Venezuela?
A military option, what is your criteria for returning to a military option and putting boots on?
Well, I don't recall the president saying he was going to put troops in Venezuela. Where did he say that?
I'm asking you, what are your...
But that's what you said. I didn't remember the president
has already said that he was ready to put American troops in Venezuela.
No, I think the president has said that he retains the right as commander-in-chief to protect the United States against any imminent threats. Maybe that involves troops, maybe that involves air power. We hope, but we don't anticipate that being the case in Venezuela.
I worry that you are playing fast and loose with our nation's
Well, I just gave you testimony here.
I just want to conclude by saying...
Yeah, but I just gave you testimony of how well things are moving forward, not as fast as everybody would like.
But you also said that in 6 or 9 months, if things don't go well, you're going to have to do something else. And the president's already said that he's not ruled out the military option. And you've also just said that, yes, we are at war. The president has wartime powers.
But every president retains the power to use military to protect...
So it's reasonable for me to ask you...
And I gave you a very specific example. Every president retains the right to defend the United States against an imminent threat. Yes, if there are just give you an example, Iranian drones deployed in Venezuela that could threaten the United States, we most certainly will address that, even if it's located in Venezuela. But we hope we don't get to that point. We don't expect to get to that point.
I don't think that...
We're not trending in that direction. That's a fact. But that said, on the one hand,
people of America are worried that this is a president who engages in yet another forever war, Mr. Secretary. We don't need to be in another forever war. And that is the path that we are going towards. And let me just say...
Well, how are we going towards a forever war if we're dealing with Delcy Rodriguez every day?
Option. You're not going to ask him to rescind his invocation of the Alien Enemies Act. That puts Americans in jeopardy. And let me just say something about the president's recent comments about NATO allies. When I served in Iraq, there were Polish forces there with us. There were British forces there with us. There were Spanish forces there with us. I personally landed in Elzi, España, which came under direct attack by insurgents. Polish troops who have worked with the Illinois military, with the Illinois National Guard for 30 years, died in Afghanistan, Mr. Secretary.
All the president
so I just
wants
want
is
to
for
say
NATO to
is
have
that
more
our NATO allies
capabilities.
have stood
He
beside
wants
us,
our allies to
and
have more
we need to maintain the strength of that alliance.
I get it. All
Senator,
the president wants is
your
our
time's
allies.
up. Not making much progress here.
Well, let me just say, the president
Let's-
just wants our allies to have more capabilities to be involved in operations like that, God forbid, in the future if necessary.
That's not what he
an
said.
unreasonable
He said
request.
that they stayed a little behind, and they certainly did not come to our defense. And
Well, not
they
every
did.
country in Europe, not every country in NATO participated in those missions. Some did.
Denmark suffered some of the greatest military casualties.
There's no doubt that many of our allies have stepped forward and provided assistance to us, and there are many others that simply don't have the capability to do it now or in the future.
That's not what the president said.
Senator
That's what he
Lee,
was pointing to.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Secretary Rubio. Frankly, be playing to Senator Rubio and playing to members here is that it should not have taken this long to have this hearing. Fundamentally, we have a crisis, I believe, in our democracy right now, which is the failure of Congress to do its job, to provide checks and balances, oversight, to provide the kind of constitutionally mandated work that we should be doing to keep a balanced government. We have operations right now that are literally costing the American taxpayer tens of millions of dollars a day. The buildup in the Caribbean alone is hundreds of millions of dollars a month, but we're not providing that kind of oversight that's necessary. So from our power to the purse, to our important work of providing a check and balance to an administration, what we're seeing right now is unacceptable and speaks to what I think is a growing constitutional crisis in our country, which is a Congress that is just lying down for the administration to do whatever it wants, whenever it wants. I want to pick up on my colleague's questioning because I actually know from years of conversations with you your heart about human rights in countries like Venezuela, Mr. Secretary. And you issued a travel warning, a level 4 travel advisory from your department's website that says, right now in Venezuela, there's a high risk of wrongful detention, torture, terrorism, kidnapping, arbitrary enforcement of laws, crime, and more. And when we hear from the president that he is in charge, that you all are running this government to that extent, I have a lot of concerns when it comes to the rampant human rights violations that are persisting. Cabello is Maduro's key hardline enforcer. He's continued to intimidate and suppress Venezuelan voices. He remains in control of Venezuela's security forces, security services, the colectivos. We're seeing extraordinary examples that the constant oppression of the people is continuing as these folks are remaining in control of the country. So I just want to know what is the plan to address in a much more aggressive manner these severe human rights violations and to try to stop these armed militias. Because if we are doing things to stabilize their government, if we're turning over resources and money to the very groups that are creating these horrors, that seems to me against America's values, and it seems to me something that is should be unacceptable to Congress on both sides.
Yeah, well, absolutely. The Venezuela I described that we want to see emerge from this is one in which none of that is happening. If you think about travel advisories are us imagining worst-case scenarios. We have a duty to warn American citizens when they travel to a place that does have a history of Americans being arrested, of Americans being taken. And they may be taken by a deliberate action of a government or entity related to the regime. They may be taken by criminal gangs that control parts of that society. For example, you have these colectivos, as they're called, which basically are these armed motorcycle gangs that are allowed to act with impunity in return for their support for the Maduro regime in the past. You have the ELN and the FARC and other drug trafficking organizations, including Tren de Aragua, that are involved.
Again.
So these are real risks that we have a duty to warn Americans, because here's what we didn't want to see, and I don't mean to interrupt you. We have this announcement that Maduro's been taken. All of a sudden, people conclude, oh, he's gone, let's flood over there, let's all go over there, and we could expose people to danger.
But this is the hypocrisy that I see. At the same time that you're issuing these human rights cautions about what's going on there for Americans, you have a president that's lifting temporary protected status for Venezuelans. Many of them are individuals that have lived in our country for years, if not decades. When I hear from the Venezuelan community, I hear an outrage that at the very same time that you are affirming here that these armed militias are running around suppressing voices, we have an administration that has said very clearly that they're not only going to be lifting temporary protective status for Venezuelans living in the U.S., but instead of protecting longtime American residents, they are, quote, the administration is putting people back on deportation flights and sending them into that madness. Does that make sense to you?
Well, first of all, the travel advisories for American citizens traveling there and the threats posed to Americans. What you're describing
why lift temporary protected status?
Well, the problem with temporary protective status was it was granted to so many people in such a vast numbers so quickly without proper vetting by the previous administration that there's a real concern that there were gang members that had received TPS simply because of the nation they came from and the time in which they came. It became so big and so massive. The overwhelming majority of Venezuelans are not members of Trained at Agua, but there were Trained at Agua and other criminal elements embedded in the TPS system. And the numbers were so large that the administration felt it had to cancel the program in order to appropriately vet it through on the individual cases.
Excuse me, Mr. Secretary, this might not surprise you. I don't trust this administration and the way they use terms like terrorist. I've seen them calling American citizens domestic terrorists who are people trying to peacefully protest. The problem we have right now is the administration continues to make policies that seem to contradict their words, and yet we don't have a process in place for Congress to do its job because people are not calling folks in for these hearings and not providing the kind of oversight that we need. It is very frustrating to me that we still have a repressive regime in power in Venezuela suppressing human rights, yet we are cooperating with them, we are funding them, and we're not calling out the ridiculousness of the violence that's going on there. At the same time, we're taking people who have lived in our country for years and years and years and sending them back into that hell where they can be targeted, where they can be abducted, where they can be held for hostage because they know they have American family members that are still here. This is a situation ripe for where we are being complicit in continuing human rights violations, and that needs to stop. And I thank you.
Just on